Hi there, and thank you for joining me, Bruce Hallas, here at the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast. For those of you who are new to the show, we just briefly explain to you what it is that we're trying to do. We're trying to introduce our listeners to disciplines based upon our research we believe can have a significant impact upon the likelihood of you being able to raise awareness, influence behaviour, and foster an appropriate organisational culture when it comes to information security. We've deliberately gone out of our way to try and interview people from outside of the security industry to sort of get that external viewpoint on the challenges that we face. But also, I'm just a believer that the challenges of awareness, behaviour and culture are universal, and there therefore must be people out there with experience and maybe research who can throw some light on this for us. One of the key objectives of each episode is that we want you, the listener, to take some key notes down from this, maybe 4 or 5 key points to go away and to conduct some further research yourself. What we're trying to do is get people to rethink the human factor. And we hope that this new episode, which is all about tone of voice, is going to get you to sit back and think, okay, what tone are we adopting in our communications with employees to help them become more aware of what their roles and responsibilities are, but really, really importantly, not just be aware, but to significantly stack the odds in your favour that they will choose to comply with your requests, your expectations. Now, people often think that things like tone of voice might not actually have a particularly large impact, but there are organisations out there in business to business and business to consumer that are using tone of voice to more effectively engage with target audiences, but also using tone of voice to reflect the values that are associated with information security and the brand of information security. It's really about, lining everything up in the particular direction that you want to be going to achieve your objectives. So Ben Afia is the gentleman that we're going to be having a chat with today. Ben's been involved with tone of voice for quite a long time. And I just think that Ben's got some really interesting insights. So we invited him on the show. And so without further ado, let's get on with the interview. Welcome to the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast. And today we have Ben Afia. Hi, Ben. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Bruce. Thank you very much for having me on.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for taking the time. I know you're incredibly busy, so I do appreciate that you've been able to spare some time to come and share some thoughts around tone of voice and what that might mean to our community when it comes to helping raise awareness and influence behaviour around information security. So, Ben, tell us a little bit of, what's your journey been over the years to get you to this point where, you're considered quite a specialist when it comes to tone of voice?
Indeed. Well, I have been writing in business for over 20 years now, 22 years, something like that. And in that time, I've written all sorts of different types of communications for all kinds of different organizations. And the place I landed at about 15 years ago, I was working for Boots the Chemist in the UK. And I got to specialize in this thing that we're going to be talking about today, tone of voice. And it really played to sort of my background in English. My strength in English was always my best subject at school. And I'd kind of forgotten that when I got into my early career. And the thing that really piqued my interest is the way that this idea can contribute to all kinds of different communications. And so, I'm sure we'll come on to this, but the sorts of things that I love looking at can be as detailed and specific as terms and conditions documents or contracts. So I think people have an idea that tone of voice might be to do with marketing or to do with sales or to do with your brand. But what's exciting to me about it is that I think it applies much more deeply, much more thoroughly throughout the organization. Okay.
And so, you've used the phrase tone of voice. I use the phrase tone of voice. But I think a lot of the listeners to the podcast here they've maybe heard of it. Some of them may actually even sort of understand what that means. But could you just help clarify what you mean when you talk about tone of voice to organizations?
Absolutely. Well, the way I think of tone of voice is that it's personality coming through in language, in words. So that can be the way that your brand personality comes across, or it's how your own personality comes across in words. So, whenever we write, although we might not be aware of it, we are conveying something about our personality, and that ultimately comes from our values. Mm-hmm. I wonder if an example or two might help sort of bring it to life and make it feel more tangible.
That would be great. Have you got an example that sort of springs to mind?
Yeah, well, there was one I wrote actually. Something I worked on when I was first looking at this idea, and it's a piece of copy for a blood glucose monitoring system for diabetics.
Right.
So if I can, I'm just going to read the previous example, and then I'm going to read the rewrite, and just see if you can tell any difference. And as I read the examples, I'd like you to just take a note of where you switched off, especially in the
okay.
Okay, so, and I'll try and slow down a bit so you can hear it. So this blood glucose monitoring system is intended for use outside the body, in vitro diagnostic use. The system is for use with fresh capillary whole blood, i.e. blood from the finger, fresh venous arterial for glucose testing only, and neonatal for glucose testing only. Whole blood may also be used by healthcare professionals, provided the sample is used within 30 minutes of collection.
Right. Okay. So
that's the first sample. How much of that did you take in?
So I must admit, the first thing I got to was the vitro diagnostic use, and I hit that, and I was like, there was this alarm just went off and went, that's gobbledygook to me. And then from there on, it became a lot harder. The one thing I remember picking up upon was, I think the suggestion was as a tool, it could be used for arteries. So, you could actually take some blood from an artery. Other than that, I'm really at a bit of a loss, to be honest with you.
And at a loss, I suspect, is how many people reading communications of all kinds are a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So if we apply some of the ideas of tone of voice to that example, I'm just going to read you a rewrite, and let's see if this is any clearer. Hopefully it will be. So you can use this system yourself to test a blood sample from your finger. Healthcare professionals can also use it to test glucose using blood from veins and arteries or from premature babies, as long as it's used within 30 minutes of collection.
Okay, right. So the first thing I'm hearing there is that actually the message was for two different audiences. There's one, you sort of mentioned yourself. So me as a listener, I'm thinking, okay, so I can use this myself and just by taking a pinprick of blood off my finger. But the second group of that, I guess the message was targeted was healthcare professionals. And basically it was saying that, that those individuals could use this and you could take samples from veins and arteries and even mentioned there something about babies as well, but that you have to do that. The blood can't be any older than 30 minutes, basically, for the tool to be effective. That's what I'm picking up from what you've just said.
Yeah. And that's absolutely right. And so what we've done with that second sample is we've applied some of the techniques that we might include in what we call tone of voice guidelines.
Right.
And they're things like writing with shorter sentences, trying to avoid medical jargon, this sort of thing. So at its heart, tone of voice is really about getting a set of writing techniques together that help people throughout an organization to be more clear and to connect with their audience.
Okay. So when you say it's about putting together really a set of sort of guidelines about writing techniques, does it also apply to more verbal communication as well?
Yes, absolutely, it does. So if you have people working in a call center, for example, answering the phones or on web chat, it absolutely applies to when they're emailing customers and to when they're on the phone when they're on the phone as well.
So tone of voice, really what we're saying is that it's about giving personality to your communication, and that communication can be either verbal or it can be written. It's about bringing to life your brand, making sure like the tone is a reflection of the brand. Is that right to say?
It is, absolutely. But even more important, it's about thinking about your audience and who you're writing to. So if we're thinking about, information security and thinking about your audience, then I'm thinking about the people that you want to influence within an organization, because, what I've learned from you, Bruce, is that information security is not purely a technical issue. It's as much about behavior as anything. And so you need to be able to help people throughout an organization to have the right behavior. And to do that, you need to communicate with them effectively. So I'm guessing that the people traditionally involved in information security are not necessarily comms people, communications professionals by trade. They might come from IT backgrounds more often, perhaps.
Yeah.
And maybe people that haven't been trained in writing or communication skills in particular. So for me, it goes much deeper. It goes to the heart of your culture and how you have people who are managing security who are looking at contracts and terms and conditions and such like to reflect your brand, but most importantly, communicate with your audience, be that internally or your customers.
Right. So can I just sort of wind us back a little bit there? Because, one thing you're pointing out there is it's really about the audience as well. Tone of voice is about the audience. Do you think, is there potential for a sort of a clash or a rub here where you might develop a tone of voice which informs the way that you communicate with people, whether it be written or verbal, okay? So it's aligned with your brand. But could you somehow find that that's fine, but if you don't really stand in the shoes of the audience and understand what is the tone of voice that best suits them, not necessarily best suits you, does that cause any challenges that we ought to be thinking about when we're trying to sort of develop engaging content, memorable content as well?
It does, absolutely, yeah. So for sure, tone of voice is very much about your brand and your personality as an individual, but also the company, the organization. But it's also about what your audience are able to hear.
Right.
And half of communication, what somebody's able to take on. So if you're communicating to customers, if let's say you're in retail and you're communicating with customers coming into stores, then it's very obvious that you need to speak a customer's language.
Yeah.
But that still means you want to get an element of the company's personality into that language. And when you're talking to people within the organization, then you still need to be using some sort of language and adapting your tone so that those people will hear your messages. Yeah. So if you use techie jargon to communicate messages through your internal communications channels, then you're going to lose quite a lot of people. You're going to lose everybody who isn't a technician, I guess, who isn't an IT professional.
So, but you need to find that balancing act, isn't it? There, that you've got to be in the shoes of the audience, your sort of your customer, your internal customer, your employees, for example, and you've got to understand what language works with them. But you've got to make sure that you integrate into that your own brand values and tone and those guidelines as well to maximize the potential of the effectiveness of the communication. That's sort of really what you're saying, yeah?
It is, absolutely. And maybe I can give you another example that will kind of bring this to life. So because my business, Afia, is all about brand and tone of voice and language, we've been quite careful, but we work with a lot of freelance writers and consultants and trainers. Mm-hmm. And so I have a security issue with those people. I mean, I haven't had any specific security issues. I could, and I'm aware that I need to encourage the right sort of behavior, because we might be sharing a client's information with a number of freelancers who will be storing that information locally. Mm-hmm. Most freelancers will work at home, so they'll be on home networks. They may not be as security savvy as people's working with an IT team behind them. So we have an information security policy, but because we're writing for writers, mm-hmm. we are adapting our language to suit Afia's personality, which is quite engaging and energetic. Uh-huh. That's what we help companies to be more human.
Yep.
And so we'll use language, for example, we've got a section in our information security policy called traveling with your devices. Mm-hmm. And the first point there is don't leave any of your gizmos and gadgets in your car. Keep things with you at all times.
Yeah.
And the second point is always take all your devices with you when you pop to the loo on public transport.
Yep.
Never be tempted to leave your stuff unattended, even for a moment.
Yep.
So, and I'm sure, as I'm saying those words, you can imagine information security policies that you've seen in the past that could be quite kind of heavy-handed and legalistic about the same message.
Yeah, that actually brings us on to an interesting point, because for many, the challenge is that the policies define the expectations of an organization from all of its employees. And so, and as soon as you sort of like put that expectations in place, it almost has this people's sense of it's a legal document in itself. And as such, as a legal document, it's there really to, manage risk to the organization, but also, with the objective being to hopefully influence behavior. When it comes to, do you ever find that rub between, when you look at the projects that you've been involved with, you go, okay, yeah, what we want to do, we want to make this communication human. We want to make it appeal to the audience that we're communicating with. But we've got a document here, which is the legal document, which in effect, you're like, okay, there's a clash that goes on between the two. Because I think one of the challenges that a lot of listeners raise with me via email and through the newsletters and stuff like that we do, is the fact that, corporate guidelines often strip away the bit that makes the communication human.
Yes, they do. And it's a really good point. And it's something that I'm quite passionate about, actually, because I don't feel that you need to use legalistic terminology in order to be legally sound.
Agreed.
So for people with that training, that's the way they've been trained. And so, unless they've been exposed to a different influence, they'll tend to write in that way. But that doesn't necessarily make for good communication. And of course, what we're talking about is how we influence behavior, especially within organizations, with people who can choose to be influenced or not, really, can't they? They can choose to ignore us a lot of the time.
It's a discretionary effort. I mean, when I look at it, I say this is in many places, a lot of it is down to the discretion of employees whether or not to comply.
Absolutely. So you can't be as heavy-handed as you might be in some situations, but also I think that you don't actually need to be that heavy-handed to achieve the right outcome of protecting the organization. And I worked some years ago with a plain English lawyer who was obsessed really with getting plain language into legal documents. And one of his arguments was that, often lawyers might claim that certain clauses exist because they've been litigated and they've proven their worth in court. And his argument is that this actually probably isn't the case at all. In fact, most likely it's that they haven't been litigated because they're not clear and nobody was prepared to stand behind them. And I think that the situation with judges, certainly in the UK, that judgment will fall on behalf of the consumer if it can be said that the meaning of the contract wasn't completely clear for them, if they couldn't be reasonably expected to understand it. Yeah. So there's a lot of movement going on in the legal field to simplify and bring in plain English. But aside from that, I think people just understanding what you're asking them to do depends on plain English. It depends on an effective tone of voice that's going to connect with that audience.
Yeah. Which is interesting because, when that goes to the heart of the matter for me when it comes to the challenges we face in information security here, which is, what is your objective? Is it to influence behavior, to really to bring about that change in behavior, and to also not just to do change of behavior? There are a lot of people that are already behaving really, really well, and are following the company guidelines and practices anyway. So it sometimes is about to reinforce it. Or is it about, this is about protecting the organization, being able to say at the end of the day, we make people aware of the roles and responsibilities. And it's that legal piece, and organizations need to make that decision, because if it's just legal, if it's there to protect the organization when something happens, should it happen, then that's one thing. But if you really genuinely want to stand a chance of influencing behavior, helping people make choices which result in positive security behaviors, then you've got to come back to the point you're making, which is, you've got to make this engaging. If people blank out as soon as they've seen the terms and conditions or the policy, if they're looking and go, that's too long, or even if they start reading and go, I don't get it, then it's sort of failed, hasn't it, in terms of achieving that objective?
Yeah, and to that point, I've got another example that's here that just kind of fits with that thought. So it's an organization that I worked with a couple of years ago who, like many financial services organizations, tend to sort of err on the side of risk averse. And so the legal teams tend to hold quite a lot of sway, which is understandable. But what often happens with legacy documents in large financial services organizations is they tend to accumulate documents that have become quite legalistic and actually start alienating customers. And let me just read you this example because I think it's quite funny. So this is about an offer. I think the context, it's a mortgage product transfer. So you're coming out of the end of your fixed term,
right? And
they're making you another offer. So this is an organization that wants to keep you as a customer,
right?
So just listen to this language for a moment.
Okay.
See as a customer how it makes you feel.
All right.
Please ensure you check through your product transfer offer carefully to see if any such action is required. We have not recommended a particular product transfer for you. You must make your own choice whether to accept this product transfer offer. This offer is valid for 3 months from the above offer date, unless we withdraw this offer, which we may, at our discretion, do at any time.
Right. Okay.
Does this sound like an organisation that wants to keep you as a customer?
It does sound a bit like a bot is sending me a message. I don't know if that's anything to do with your tone of voice, but you just get that sense of, where's the emotion? Where's the, we'd really like to keep you on board, please stay. I don't get a feel of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what happens is that the legalistic messages overcome the customer-friendly messages, which is, we'd love to keep you as a customer, and here's our offer.
Yeah.
And so I often find, so I tend to work with marketing teams and communications teams, and so there's often this tussle between communication, customer communication, and legal and regulatory teams.
Yeah.
But many organizations now are kind of bringing those conversations together. And, I've worked on terms and conditions documents with energy companies, life and pensions companies, where we've brought lawyers, regulatory guys, compliance guys together with the communicators, the marketers, the product people to work out, well, what are we trying to achieve here? And if we start from what impact do we want to have on customers? Because at the end of the day, many organizations exist to serve customers.
Yeah.
That's how they make their money and exist and survive. And so bringing those different groups of people together to think about, how do we want to serve customers better? How do we want to look after them? Can quite dramatically influence how the organization then looks to protect itself, because it can be done with a decent tone of voice.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess there's two things that spell out of that. I guess we need to deal with the immediate one. There is, the sense of, what's the impact on customers? What do we want the desired impact to be on the customer? I'm a real believer that you raise awareness with the objective of influencing behaviour in some way. And if you're not raising awareness to influence behaviour, what's the real value? You've got to have a clear reason why you're doing that. When you're looking at the impact on customers of the communications that you're passing on to them, how important is it to having a well-defined brand when coming up with tone of voice guidelines? And when I say brand to you, Ben, what does brand mean to you?
Well, brand means really what you stand for, what you believe in as an organization. So for me, it's about your values. Brand is not just a thing that's about marketing. It's not the logo. It's not the advertising. It's really about what you believe in, what you stand for as an organization. And when you then create tone of voice guidelines from brand and values that the organization holds dear, you have something that people trust and believe in, because tone of voice is something that people do. And if they're not doing it, it's not working. So in the same way as an information security policy is something that you need people to act on, you need to influence people's behavior. Tone of voice is the same thing. You need to persuade people that it's right for their customers, it's right for their work. And if it's true to your values, then that makes a big difference to whether they're going to buy into it. So it's not just about creating a fancy tone of voice that appeals to customers. It's about something that relates to your values and to what you believe in as an organization.
So I guess then, without having your values clearly defined, if you then went into a tone of voice exercise, if you wanted to take to apply the benefits of tone of voice to your communication, it's a bit like a ship without a rudder, isn't it? It's like, the values really provide the guidance to the tone of voice.
Yes, absolutely. Without a strong set of values, it's very hard to develop a tone of voice, because, in personality terms, I think the personality comes from those values. And, personality is a bit like, it's very similar to a human personality. A human being behaves in different ways, shows different sides of their personality in different situations. So, if I'm mucking around with my kids, I probably sound different to when I'm in a meeting with a client, but I still hold the same values. It's just that on different circumstances, I might express a different side of my personality. Mm-hmm. But you're absolutely right. The key to it is having a strong set of values that the organization truly buys into. And what I often find is that organizations might be quite sales driven and very much driven by the numbers that they have to deliver to the city.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can make it difficult to make decisions that are based on values and the brand. Even though they might be right for people within the organization, they might be right for customers. If they've got to deliver results, that's quite a tricky pressure to juggle with.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you think in your experience that sometimes part of the problem about sort of getting, setting the values or using the values to guide the tone of voice for all your internal communication, but also for all your external communication? I mean, that's where, a lot of your work is. Do you think that sometimes there's a gap between what people say the values are and what are the values actually at an operational level? And see, this brings me back to a point you were making earlier about, I wrote down here, out of sync tone of voice. You say one thing, but the reality on the ground is that it's quite different. And that's probably guided by the fact that, you often see these value statements that are made, and then you take those value statements and they're on the wall or wherever, and then people turn around and go, that's not how I understand it here within the organization. So do you see that, the difference in values, what they say and what's actually in reality, and how does that have an impact upon tone of voice?
Yeah, very much so. It happens a lot, and I think that the reason is, the intention is there. The intention is right when people are developing brand and thinking about their values. Mostly, I see those values are very dearly held, but it can be quite hard to make the change necessary in an organization to introduce a new set of values or to update the values and get, especially in large organizations, if you've got tens and tens of thousands of people, either, around the UK or around the world, then, that's a lot of people to influence. And really, we're talking about a culture change. Mm-hmm. And culture change is difficult. I think some statistic from PwC some years ago said that 8 out of 10 change programs fail in large organizations.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's from lack of trying. I think that's because it's very difficult to change behavior. And the reason for that, I think, is that when we have change forced upon us, we tend to be quite resistant to it. People, we worry that our jobs are going to change, our management's going to change, our teams are going to change. The people that make life bearable at work, the colleagues we have around us are maybe going to change. And so we don't like that change.
Mm.
And so we have to make that in a way that's quite sensitive to the reality that people experience day to day.
That's interesting, because I think your point about people don't like change, and it's well known. It's like the status quo bias, and I'm not talking about the British band that was, but people have this bias towards keeping things as they are, unless they're the ones asking for the change.
Yeah,
and then it's suddenly like, then they appreciate the value of it. And then next month we've got an interview with Dan Arley, who I'm aware that you're aware of who Dan Arley is, and he's a very famous behavioral economist. And that's one of the things there. The sense of, on one hand, people are resistant to change, but when it's a change that they want to see happening, they're all for it.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting conundrum. Is that, okay, understanding the bias around there. So it's almost what we call an endowment effect, where people have worked towards the need for a change. They've contributed to the debate about the need for a change, and then a decision's been made that you need to have change, and they're really behind it. But if it's not something that they've been involved in,
absolutely,
then they're not behind it, and they prefer the status quo. Which brings me to a question for you. How important is it, when looking at developing a tone of voice, a set of tone of voice guidelines for an organization, how important it is to get broad stakeholder engagement, not from the very top of the organization, but also all the way down to sort of cascade and get people involved? What difference does that make?
I think it's absolutely crucial. So, I've spent the last 15 years or so specializing in the area of tone of voice. And throughout that time, I've been scratching my head over how to make a change and make it stick from, the senior levels of the organization to the bottom. And I think there are two approaches, really. One is about absolutely having senior stakeholders involved in the process, but it's also about having a representative sample of people from across the organization. So clearly, you can't necessarily consult tens of thousands of people on your new values, your new personality, your new tone of voice, But if people at least feel that their area or their area of the business has been consulted, then they're more likely to engage with it. And so that's the way I tend to approach it. First of all, by bringing very senior people together and having a very senior sponsor.
Yep.
For, tone of voice tends to be managed by, say, a brand director or a marketing director, CMO. So it's having a very senior sponsor, but it's also involving people from throughout the organization and from different levels. So quite often I'll interview across the globe at different levels of the organization, different levels of seniority, but also in different roles. And so that when we're piecing together the story of the values and personality and tone of voice, we have stories about what life is really like in the organization and what the organization is like at its very best from throughout the organization. And that tends to give the program more credibility.
So here's I think it's a tricky question, because I just think culture is, it's a tricky opportunity. I mean, there's definitely opportunity there. You've mentioned culture on a number of occasions during this chat that we've had as well. But, when I think of tone of voice, I'm thinking, okay, so I'm going to do a communication here. We're going to put a communication campaign together. And you mentioned there, you've got to be thinking about it from put yourself in the boots of the audience. But let's say my audience is all over the world. Okay.
Yeah.
And in the previous interview with Hertjan Hofstede, and, even from my own research around culture, I know that, depending on the language that you're using, it can have a real impact upon how people interpret the information that's given to them. In sort of a UK, North America sort of context, the meaning is in the words on the whole. Whereas you go to countries that use the romantic languages, as they call them, like Latin, for example. So you're looking at South America, Southern Europe. Then a lot of what people say is it's not just the words that are said, it's what's in between the words as well.
Yeah.
So, creating tone of voice for communications that go across both, that Anglo-Saxon sort of world, but also go across the Latin world. And then, obviously looking out into the Far East. What risk does that bring to creating a great campaign incorporating tone of voice?
Yeah, really interesting question, because I'm just at the moment working with a UK but also global mobile phone company, and just come back from a few trips to India where I've been helping their web chat teams in India to relate to British customers better.
Right.
Now, so this is working for the UK part of a global business. And so this is helping Indian teams to understand British customers better and use the UK tone of voice to relate to them.
Yeah.
And there are differences that are pretty important. And one of the things that I noticed in particular, for example, many Eastern cultures, including India, are much more relationship-based cultures. Relationship is vital to trust, but also they are what I think of as we cultures, where, say, Britain and the US are more me cultures, more individualistic.
Yeah.
And what that means for the way that you help people to communicate differently, by recognizing that difference, you can help people to understand that if they come from a relationship-driven culture, they're going to want to establish rapport in a different way, perhaps to the way that customers in the UK might want to hear it. So to give the specific example of web chat, why do you use web chat to answer problems, with your mobile phone? It's probably there's something wrong. You want to find out what your bill is. You're usually trying to get a problem solved.
Yeah.
Certainly as a British or an American customer, you're probably not looking to build a relationship. If you wanted to become friends with the advisor on the end of the line, you would have made a phone call probably, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
So given that situation, the situation the customer's in, they want to get a job done, they want to get a task done. It's helping the teams in India who might build rapport in a different way to the way we do in the UK to understand that difference and relate to it by being a bit more direct and more succinct and getting the job done.
Yeah.
So, you're absolutely right. There are quite substantial differences by looking at dimensions of cultural difference across the globe. And I think that your tone of voice and your values then have to flex depending on the local circumstance. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So that's really interesting, because I'm a bit of a believer that you can have a centralized sort of approach to something, but it does truly reflect the local audience and the local context. I mean, I call it glocal.
Yeah.
But, I do believe that you can do that. You can put a framework in which then you got the guidelines, which then people at a local level can then say, yeah, that's great. And now let me incorporate into that my local cultural context, my local, insights to make the most of the set of guidelines around tone of voice.
Well, and I have a good example there, Bruce, because a few years ago, I was working for one of the big IT security companies.
Okay.
You'll know their name, but they are global.
Okay.
They tend to focus on the business to business side of security. And I work very closely with the creative director here, and he recognized that he couldn't roll out exactly the same guidelines in every country. And so what he did was he went to each country. He had a very clear idea about his intention for the brand.
Mm-hmm.
And the essence of the idea was being about simplicity and support for you as somebody in business.
Yep.
Rather than trying to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
Something that our listeners will be all too familiar with in terms of, it's a plague upon our industry.
Yeah. So this creative director colleague of mine's, thinking was take the essence of that idea, but then let the local situation dictate how writing would adapt, because grammar works differently in different countries and different cultures.
Yeah.
So, for example, in the UK, we use a lot of passive language to avoid responsibility.
Okay.
And so we might say, look, take responsibility and give more energy to your sentences by using active sentences.
Okay. Can you give us an example of a difference between a passive and an active sentence, Ben?
Yeah. So if I say to you, a letter will be sent in due course.
Okay.
You don't know who's going to send that letter, who they're going to send it to. It's quite a flat, dead sentence. But if I say, I'll write to you within 7 days, it's clear who's writing, who's reading, who's receiving that letter.
Yeah.
There's a greater sense of responsibility. I'm doing something for you.
Mm-hmm.
And there's more energy in the sentence as well. Now, so using active sentences is a technique that we use in the UK quite a lot, but it doesn't translate in the same way in the UK, in Germany and France, for example.
Yeah.
Because they just don't use the passive form in the way that we do in British. Now, I'm not an expert in those languages, but I find we have to adapt when we're working in those countries.
Okay. And I think that's really important, because I know that when we've looked at the difference between active and passive, and we've sort of understand the cognitive reasoning behind that as well, and you explain that to people and they take that on board and they do something with it, it's like, it really does make a difference. And it's interesting because anecdotally, I think a lot of people go, yeah, they understand it, but it's like, well, why would you do that? I think your explanation, and I know my work around cognitive pieces, which hopefully we might cover with Dan next month, provides the explanation behind that. But then it's also that thing around, you can't make assumptions about the audience that you're communicating with. You really do need to do some research in that particular target market or target audience, whichever way you want to call it, so that better informs how you go around the development of your communication piece. Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, look, I think we could carry on talking for absolutely ages, Ben. There's a load of things I'm looking down here and I'm going, there's at least 6 points I've written here that I haven't actually come back to with you.
Well, maybe you'll have to have me back.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that. I am just thinking that there is plenty more to talk around tone of voice. And I know that you've come from a background as well. You do some copy work as well. So, copy is something that is on the agenda in terms of what we want to cover within the podcast as well. So maybe there's a bit of a crossover there as well. So, yeah, let's sort something out in the future. But in the meantime, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you very much for painting the picture about what tone of voice is, but also how the interdependencies with other sort of disciplines that I think as a community, the security community needs to be thinking, okay, we need to reach out to people who bring these skills to us. And interestingly, the Ponman Institute released a report at the beginning of, I believe it was this week, and in it, CISOs were basically asked what their biggest concerns were regarding cybersecurity, and the number one was the human factor. And one of the key things that came out of that was not necessarily the competence of employees, though obviously, that's always a challenge in terms of making sure that they actually choose the right behaviors. But it was also about the skills within the security team to develop effective campaigns and strategies for trying to bring about that change. And I think that's been the key thing from today's chat. This is a skill set that not a lot of people within the security industry have. And it's not something you can just pick up necessarily. Getting some guidelines together will help you, and then applying them and getting some experience over time will sharpen your skills. So that's a key thing for me that's come out of today, and also from that research that was released earlier this week.
I think you're right. But these are things you can teach. Not everybody is born to be a great communicator. But there are techniques you can teach. So there is a difference you can make, I think, to people of all kinds of different backgrounds and training.
Yeah. And I mean, that's something I would completely go by. You've got guidelines, and then training on people upon those guidelines can really make the difference. So yeah, we're completely agreed on that. All right. Well, in that case, Ben, thank you very much for joining us on the show, and we'll stay in contact, and we'll try and arrange another time for you to come and share some insights around tone of voice with the listeners here on the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Bruce.
Hi. I found that really interesting. The conversation with Ben really reaffirmed, what I personally believe and I've seen working within organisations, which is that getting your tone of voice right, the tone of voice within which you communicate broadly around information security within an organisation is really, really important. Organizations, when they're selling their products and services, or trying to communicate a message, for example, governments, they've all come to recognize the power of the tone of the voice in the communication. And if you've got a strong brand and you're quite clear about what your values are as a brand, then having a tone that reflects that makes absolute sense. So I think that there are takeaways there. The question for us in the security community is, what is your tone of voice? Does it really reflect your brand? How well do people engage with that? Do your communications actually have any element of tone of voice, or are you just getting your own team to write this without any real direction or steerage in terms of how you want to appear to be perceived by your audience when they receive your message? So what I do know is there's a lot more to cover around tone of voice, and Ben's gratefully suggested that you can come and share some thoughts. So keep an eye on what we're up to. Ben will be around later on in the year. So how do you actually keep an eye? How do you stay abreast of what we're doing here at the podcast? Best ways to do that are either to sign up to the feed on iTunes or on the Marmalade Box website. We'll let you know when there's new podcasts. Alternatively, go to marmaladebox.com and sign up for the newsletter, or the update that we do there contains a hash of all the things that we found interesting around awareness, behaviour and culture over the previous month. And that also includes, new blogs that we've written, articles that we found interesting, written by third parties, a book reference. So from my own personal research, there are books I recommend to you. And also, what podcast has come out that month, and also a heads up as to what podcast is coming through next month. Now, if you've got a question for our guests, please, you can submit them through to us. So we did an interview this week with Dan Arley. A couple of listeners actually sent in some questions. We selected one of those questions, and we're going to be sharing that question, or we have shared it actually, with Dan. And we'll obviously mention who put the question in as well. So you get a call out on air. Now, going forward, we're calling out to all our listeners and asking them to give us a testimonial to let us know what they think about the show. I've personally had a great chat with a listener who's really found what we're doing here at the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast has set them on a new sort of direction in terms of how they think around awareness, behaviour and culture. And, it's great having had the conversation. I asked them, could you give us a testimonial? And they did it. They did it, with that evening. And it's a great testimonial. And we've got a couple of testimonials on iTunes as well. But I'm going to ask you as our listeners, if you really think that this is making you rethink, if it's really adding some value to you, please provide us with a review on iTunes, or send us a testimonial via the site, or get in contact with me personally, bruce.hallas@marmaladebox.com, and let me know what you think of the show, because it's always great to let the team know that, people really do appreciate the work that's being done here at the podcast. Right. So who do we have on the show next time round? Next time round, we have Dan Arley, the second most influential behavioural psychologist in the world, or he was being voted that recently. somebody that I've been speaking to now for the best part of 3.5 years, and talking about, the potential role of behavioral economics and behavioral science in awareness, behavior, and culture for information security professionals. And I'm, really, really looking forward to having that chat with him and sharing that chat with you. So without any further ado, it's been great having you on board. I hope you found it of interest. I hope you've got maybe 4 or 5 killer points to take away. And look, love to have you join us on the next show. And thanks. Bye.